The Nexus Academy floated in the void like a chrome-plated testament to galactic arrogance, its gleaming spires reaching toward stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of 1,000 civilizations. Here, in this monument to military excellence, the galaxy's finest warrior species gathered to prove what everyone already knew, that some beings were simply born superior. The Academy's halls echoed with the confident chittering of Vorthak cadets, their crystalline bodies refracting light into dazzling displays of casual intimidation. Zephyrians glided past in graceful arcs, their energy-wreathed forms leaving trails of ionized air that made the corridor lighting flicker like a disco having an existential crisis. The Crumnids stomped through with their characteristic four-arm swagger, each appendage capable of wielding weapons that could level city blocks. And then there were the humans. Oh, the humans. The galaxy's favorite charity case. The species that had somehow stumbled their way into the Galactic Military Consortium through what most aliens assumed was a clerical error of cosmic proportions. They were given spots at the Academy the same way participation trophies were handed out at children's sporting events, not because they earned them, but because it would be impolite to exclude them entirely. Commander Vexai, a Vorthak whose crystal formation had grown particularly sharp over his 3 centuries of military service, surveyed the morning combat assessment with a kind of detached amusement reserved for watching primitive species attempt firemaking. His multifaceted eyes reflected the training ground in kaleidoscopic fragments, as alien cadets demonstrated techniques that would make seasoned warriors weep with envy. The Zephyrian top cadet, Zolt, was currently reducing a holographic enemy battalion to subatomic particles with casual flicks of his energy-wreathed appendages. Each movement generated enough power to run a small space station, delivered with a kind of artistic flair that made lesser beings question their life choices. Impressive, Vexai noted, his voice carrying the crystalline resonance that made everything he said sound like divine proclamation, though perhaps excessive for a simple training exercise. Zolt's response was a shimmer of smug satisfaction that radiated across multiple spectrums. Excellence requires no restraint, Commander. Unlike some species, we Zephyrians understand that mediocrity is not a virtue to be celebrated. The comment drew appreciative harmonics from the other alien cadets. They all knew who that jab was aimed at. In the far corner of the training ground, barely visible behind a stack of regulation equipment crates, Kira Thorne was methodically cleaning her gear with the kind of quiet precision that most people associated with either meditation or serial killing. She was human, which immediately placed her in the Academy's informal hierarchy somewhere between tolerated and amusing pet. Her combat scores were abysmal. Her tactical simulations consistently failed, and her social integration could be generously described as non-existent. She was also, if one bothered to look closely, and nobody did, always watching. While Zolt preened and other cadets jockeyed for attention, Kira observed. She noted the 3-second delay in Crumnid reflexes after extending their upper arms. She catalogued the specific frequency at which Zephyrian energy shields fluctuated during regeneration cycles. She memorized the exact angle at which Vorthak crystal formations became vulnerable to lateral pressure. Not that anyone cared about her observations. After all, what could a human possibly understand about combat that the galaxy's apex predator species hadn't already perfected? The answer to that question was about to become uncomfortably obvious. Attention, cadets, Vexai's voice cut through the training ground chatter like a tuning fork through tissue paper. The annual Apex trial begins tomorrow. The announcement hit the assembled cadets like a meteor strike on a quiet planet. The Apex trial was the Academy's most prestigious competition, a single elimination tournament that determined not just bragging rights, but career trajectories. Winners found themselves fast-tracked to elite units. Losers often found themselves reconsidering their life choices while filing paperwork on forgotten outposts. The rules are simple, Vexai continued, though his tone suggested that simplicity was relative when dealing with species that considered quantum physics recreational reading. Single combat. No weapons beyond standard Academy issue. Victory conditions are surrender, incapacitation, or death, though we strongly discourage the latter, as it creates unnecessary paperwork. The alien cadets erupted into excited chatter, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, harmonic resonances, and electromagnetic fluctuations that would have given a linguist a migraine. The betting pools that immediately sprang up were as predictable as gravity and twice as merciless to human hopes. Zolt was the overwhelming favorite, followed closely by a Vorthak battle prodigy named Kekstow and a Crumnid demolition specialist called Thrumforstrikes. The human cadets weren't even mentioned in the initial odds, dismissed as thoroughly as last season's fashion trends. Kira, still cleaning her gear in methodical silence, allowed herself the smallest of smiles. It was the kind of expression that would have made ancient Earth predators nervous, had there been any around to recognize it. The first day of the tournament dawned, or at least, the artificial lighting cycle that passed for dawn on the Academy station shifted to its morning spectrum. The arena was packed with cadets, instructors, and various dignitaries who had come to witness the galaxy's future military leaders tear each other apart with enthusiastic professionalism. Kira's first opponent was a Crumnid named Gorthak the Inevitable, whose forearms were each the size of tree trunks and whose reputation for crushing opponents was as well established as the laws of thermodynamics. The betting pools had given this match approximately 30 seconds, and most of those were allocated to the time it would take Gorthak to cross the arena floor. Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of indeterminate gender classification, the announcer's voice boomed across the arena, presenting Gorthak the Inevitable, conqueror of 17 systems and breaker of, well, everything really. Gorthak entered the arena to thunderous applause, his forearms flexing in a display that caused several spectators to spontaneously reassess their own life achievements. He was 3 meters of concentrated violence wrapped in ceremonial combat armor that bore the scars of a dozen actual wars. And his opponent, the announcer continued with noticeably less enthusiasm, Cadet Kira Thorne, representing, humanity. The applause that greeted Kira could generously be described as polite, in the same way that a nuclear winter could be described as chilly. She walked into the arena with her characteristic quiet stride, looking for all the world like someone who had taken a wrong turn on the way to a library. "This is embarrassing," muttered a Zephyrian instructor to his colleague. "We should have arranged for her to forfeit. This won't even be educational." The opening bell rang with all the ceremony of a death knell. Gorthak charged with the subtlety of a collapsing star, his forearms spread wide to prevent any possibility of evasion. It was a tactic that had worked against every opponent he had ever faced, a simple application of overwhelming force that rendered strategy irrelevant. Kira waited. She stood perfectly still as 3 meters of enraged Crumnid thundered toward her, showing no sign of the terror that any reasonable being should have displayed when facing imminent pulverization. To the spectators, she looked frozen with fear. To anyone who bothered to look at her eyes, she looked like she was solving an equation. At precisely the moment when collision became inevitable, Kira moved. It wasn't a dodge, exactly, nor was it a counterattack in any conventional sense. It was more like watching physics suddenly decide to take a coffee break. Kira slipped sideways with liquid precision, her right hand describing a small, almost casual arc that intersected with the inside of Gorthak's left knee at the exact microsecond, when his weight distribution made that joint vulnerable. The sound that followed was not the thunderous crash of bodies colliding that the audience expected. Instead, it was a sharp crack of cartilage separating, followed by the much louder thud of a 3-meter Crumnid discovering that gravity applied to everyone equally. Gorthak hit the arena floor with enough force to register on seismic equipment, his invincible charge transformed into an ungainly sprawl by the simple application of leverage and timing. He tried to rise, managed to get 2 arms under him, then made the mistake of putting weight on his compromised leg. The resulting howl of pain and frustration echoed through the arena like the death cry of certainty itself. "Winner," the announcer said after a moment of stunned silence, Cadet Kira Thorne. The arena erupted in confused chatter as spectators tried to process what they had just witnessed. Most settled on fluke. It was easier to accept than the alternative, which was that they had fundamentally misunderstood something important about human capabilities. Kira helped Gorthak to the medical bay with the same quiet courtesy she showed everyone, then returned to her quarters to prepare for the next round. She had work to do, and not much time to do it. The quarterfinals brought her face-to-face with Kekstow, a Vorthak whose crystal formation was considered a work of art by those who appreciated deadly beauty. Unlike the brute force approach favored by Crumnids, Vorthak combat philosophy emphasized defense and patience, wearing down opponents through attrition while maintaining perfect protection. "I will not underestimate you as Gorthak did," Kextar announced as they took their positions. His voice carried harmonic overtones that made the arena itself seem to listen. "Your victory was instructive." The Academy was paying attention now. Word of the upset had spread through the station faster than gossip through a small town, and suddenly everyone wanted to see the human who had embarrassed a Crumnid battle champion. The betting pools had actually started including her name, though still with odds that suggested bookmakers considered her chances slightly worse than spontaneous combustion. This time, Kira didn't wait for her opponent to make the first move. She circled Kextar with patient steps, studying his defensive posture with a kind of clinical attention usually reserved for particularly interesting viruses. The Vorthak warrior rotated to maintain facing, his crystalline structure refracting the arena lights into dazzling patterns that would have disoriented most opponents. Most opponents, however, weren't human. Kira had spent the previous evening reviewing recordings of every Vorthak combat demonstration in the Academy database. She had identified the 17 different defensive configurations that their crystal formations could assume, catalogued the transition times between each formation, and noted the energy expenditure required for rapid changes. More importantly, she had noticed that Vorthak warriors unconsciously favored their dominant side during formation shifts, a tiny tell that created a window of vulnerability lasting approximately 0.3 seconds. She waited for that window with the patience of a spider. When Kextar shifted from his high guard configuration to a mid-level defensive stance, a transition that every Vorthak instinctively made when facing a circling opponent, Kira struck. Not with her fists or feet, but with a thrown handful of arena sand that she had quietly collected during her patient circling. The sand struck Kextar's crystal formation at the precise angle needed to trigger sympathetic vibrations throughout his structure. It was a technique that no Vorthak would ever think to use against another Vorthak, because it required understanding their crystal matrix at a level that most Vorthak themselves didn't possess. But humans, it turned out, were quite good at studying things that others took for granted. Kextar's defensive formation collapsed into harmonic chaos, his crystal structure singing a discordant note that made everyone in the arena wince. In the 3 seconds it took him to restore stability, Kira had closed the distance and applied a sleeper hold with a kind of gentle persistence that made resistance futile. "Winner," the announcer said, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment that had become increasingly familiar, Cadet Kira Thorne. The arena was quieter this time. The easy explanations were getting harder to maintain, and uncomfortable questions were beginning to surface. Questions like, what if the galaxy had been wrong about humans? What if quiet observation was actually more dangerous than loud boasting? The semifinals brought the question into sharp focus. Zolt had been watching Kira's previous matches with a kind of nervous attention usually reserved for approaching natural disasters. The arrogant confidence that had carried him through the early rounds was showing cracks, and his pre-fight banter had taken on a distinctly defensive tone. "Your luck runs out here, human," he declared as they faced off in the arena's center. Energy crackled around his form like a personal aurora, and the air itself seemed to bend in his presence. "I have studied your primitive techniques. You cannot surprise me as you did the others." Kira tilted her head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey polite interest and mortal threat in equal measure. "Have you?" she asked, and it was the first time most people in the arena had heard her speak above a whisper. Her voice was pleasant, unremarkable, the kind of tone you might use to comment on the weather. It was also, for reasons that no one could quite articulate, absolutely terrifying. The fight that followed was a masterclass in the difference between power and precision. Zolt unleashed energies that could have powered cities, reshaping the arena floor with casual gestures and filling the air with displays that made the aurora look like a cheap nightlight. He was magnificent, terrible, and completely outmatched. Kira moved through his attacks like water flowing around stones, never quite where the energy strikes landed, never using more movement than absolutely necessary. She had studied not just Zephyrian combat techniques, but Zolt specifically, his preferred attack patterns, his energy expenditure rates, his tendency to favor spectacular displays over tactical efficiency. The end came not with a thunderous clash, but with a whisper of movement. Zolt, overextended from a particularly impressive energy barrage, found himself off balance for exactly one heartbeat. In that heartbeat, Kira was there, her hand pressing gently against a pressure point that human anatomists had identified centuries ago in their own species and that applied, with minor modifications, to energy-based life forms. Zolt's personal aurora flickered and died like a candle in a hurricane. He swayed once, managed to look genuinely surprised, then toppled forward with the kind of graceless finality that reality reserves for punctured egos. The arena was dead silent. "Winner," the announcer whispered, "Cadet Kira Thorne." The silence stretched until it became a physical presence, pressing down on the assembled beings like the weight of reconsidered assumptions. In the space of 3 fights, everything they thought they knew about human capabilities had been quietly, efficiently demolished. But there was still one more fight to go. Commander Vexhai stood in the center of the arena, his crystal formation arranged in the most formal combat configuration his species possessed. He had not planned to participate in the tournament, but circumstances had evolved beyond his expectations. The Academy's reputation was at stake, along with fundamental assumptions about galactic hierarchy that had stood unchallenged for millennia. "Cadet Thorne," he said, his voice carrying harmonics of respect that had been entirely absent from their previous interactions. "You have surprised us all. But this ends now." Kira stepped into the arena's center with the same quiet stride she had used from the beginning. She looked small next to Vexhai's imposing crystal structure, a fact that the betting pools, now frantically recalculating their odds, were treating as the commander's primary advantage. "I understand," she said simply. The fight began without fanfare. Vexhai was everything that Kira's previous opponents had not been: patient, adaptive, and possessed of 3 centuries of combat experience that spanned multiple wars and dozens of different fighting styles. He did not underestimate her, did not rely on overwhelming force or spectacular displays. He fought like the master warrior he was, treating her as a threat worthy of his complete attention. It was the greatest compliment she had ever received. For 5 full minutes, they danced around each other in a display of technique that had the arena's spectators holding their breath. Vexhai's crystal formations shifted through configurations that most of the audience had never seen, each one perfectly chosen to counter Kira's approach. She, in turn, adapted to each configuration with fluid grace, never committing to attacks that wouldn't work, always probing for openings that might not exist. It was, in its way, the most beautiful thing that anyone in the arena had ever seen. A master warrior at the peak of his abilities facing an opponent who had turned quiet observation into its own form of deadly art. The end came, as endings often do, in a moment that seemed almost anticlimactic. Vexhai, executing a particularly complex defensive transition, committed to a formation that required a 3-second stabilization period. It was the kind of vulnerability that occurred perhaps once in every 1,000 combinations, visible only to someone who had studied Vorthak combat techniques with obsessive attention to detail. Kira had been waiting for it. Her strike was not flashy or dramatically devastating. It was simply perfect, a precisely calculated blow delivered at exactly the right angle with exactly the right force to shatter the specific crystal matrix that Vexhai had formed. The sound of breaking crystal rang across the arena like a bell tolling the end of an era. Vexhai's formation collapsed, his 3 centuries of experience rendered irrelevant by a human who had spent her academy years doing exactly what everyone expected, sitting quietly in corners and paying attention. He managed to remain standing long enough to nod once, a gesture of acknowledgement that transcended species barriers. Then he toppled forward with the dignity of a mountain accepting erosion. "Winner," the announcer said into the stunned silence, "Cadet Kira Thorne." The arena exploded into chaos, not of celebration, but of fundamental assumptions crumbling like poorly constructed buildings in an earthquake. Faculty members frantically consulted databases, trying to understand how they had so thoroughly misjudged human potential. Alien cadets stared at Kira with expressions that ranged from or to existential crisis. In the aftermath, as medical teams tended to the fallen warriors and investigators began reviewing every moment of the tournament, the truth began to emerge. Kira's background, previously dismissed as irrelevant, suddenly became very relevant indeed. Her childhood spent on a frontier colony where survival meant observing everything and trusting nothing. Her training under a retired human special forces operative who had learned the hard way that in a galaxy full of superior species, adaptation was humanity's greatest weapon. Most importantly, Her understanding that in a universe where everyone expected humans to be inferior, being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. The Galactic Military Consortium would spend the following years completely restructuring their assessment protocols, incorporating human training methodologies, and grudgingly admitting that perhaps they had overlooked something important about the newest member species. But that's a story for another day. On this day, in this arena, the galaxy learned a lesson that species across the stars would remember for generations to come: never, ever, underestimate the quiet ones. They might just be paying attention. And attention, as it turned out, was the most dangerous weapon in the universe.